I suppose for me, it's an indication or a recognition of this argument of we live in a complex world with complex problems, and will a bunch of kind of super intelligent specialists ever be able to connect the dots enough to formulate potential solutions to the problems we've got?
Exercise foresight, poor eyesight, couldn't fist fight, had to overcompensate. Learn to be clairvoyant, see around corners, read signals and warnings, interpret omens, respond accordingly to...
Broadcast from later, we're exchanging weak signals of change and trying to understand their significance. A weak signal of change is just something we notice that we don't fully understand yet, but we suspect it might be meaningful in shaping the futures of our lives and society. It's an event, an idea, an issue, or some other emergent development. From later, we're steady soaking up the signals and trying to make sense of what's changing. And on these broadcasts, we give a glimpse of an early part of that process, that widening divergence, the first opening angle in the double diamond. We're generating ideas and showing you what it looks like when you're trying to understand something you don't know anything about. It's structured like show and tell. A few of us each bring in a signal we've noticed. The rest of us do not know what that is in advance. Collectively, we try to make sense of it and speculate on where it might lead. If you're listening and you feel lost and you don't understand what we're talking about, it's not a problem. Neither do we. This is literally the newest stuff we know about. If you're listening and you like this, you think it's a good idea to practice this practice, I encourage you to formalize something like it. Do the same with your own friends and colleagues. Plus, let us know, like, subscribe, comment, get at us with your feedback. Tell us who you think should join one of these conversations. I don't know anything. Everybody just trying to figure it out as we go. Today on the Room Call, we have myself, Robert Bolton, our producer, Jeremy Glenn. Returning to broadcast once again is Tobias Revell, Design Futures Lead at Arup. Hi, Tobias. We have futurist and weird problem solver Trevor Haldenby here. He's principal at Weird Advisory. Welcome back, Trevor.
Good morning. Thank you.
And Jem Barton is here. Jem leads Super Futures at RCA. She founded Experiential Realism. Her work in speculative spatial design is about critiquing the emerging interactions among people, spaces, and places. Welcome, Jem.
Hey, guys. Thanks for having me. Hi.
Hi. Thanks for being here. What's new?
I'm new.
You're new here.
That's for the first time. Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
I've got a collection of insights / signals for you guys. I've been doing something similar with my students, actually,
cool.
At the moment, although we call it Crude hints, similar kind of vibes. The architecture adjacent listeners might recognize the phrase, possibly. It was a sort of fictional text written by an architect called John Soane. You guys have heard of him. He wrote it in 1812, and he was like one of the first, I think, to write this story from the future about where he lived. He imagined his home as this ruin in the future, and the people who were visiting it were trying to figure out who might have lived there, whether it was an architect or a monk or a lawyer or a magician, I think the other one was. And he was sort of floating these hints to the surface for them. So, yeah.
Cool. And I always find weak signals to be kind of a flawed word for what it is, mainly just because it's unintuitive. I sometimes prefer faint signals, and but also it's like this, military radar metaphor. Is that the reason for going with to just kind of stay away from that source of the analogy?
Not so much. I think because my teaching and my students kind of come at futures and foresight from a spatial perspective, we often utilize the same practices, but maybe don't call them the same names.
Yeah.
Also, crude hints kind of sounds, I don't know, I quite like the way it sounds. Weak signals.
Saucy.
Maybe it doesn't sound as cool. I don't know. I don't want to.
Yeah. You won't offend me. Yeah, it's funny. This subject has come up recently. I've been kind of interested in the sometimes hilarious appropriation by the architecture world of other areas. And we were talking about acupunctural strategy recently, and this kind of I don't know. It's a playful sort of grab bag of terminology that gets used.
Architecture does like to do that.
But it's also been done. I remember in my first job, there was someone who was like an experience architect. That was their title. And I would always make fun of them like about that. And how is that different from a regular architect?
Yeah, I mean, architects and the discipline, this kind of links to my signal or hint in a way, tend to like to stretch, reach out tentacles across disciplinary boundaries quite a lot, yet are incredibly protective over their title, right? So the word architect, they kind of like to seep out and creep out, but others creeping in is less.
Right. And the like the TCM doctor is so generous with allowing, the use of acupunctural strategy. It's not a fair exchange.
I'll give you acupuncture if you give me load bearing beams.
Sure. Thank you.
That's good. There's some room here for progressing the at least marketing of the field of acupuncture. I'm really curious about something you posted recently, Jim, the research into individual identity and futures practice. Could you tell us a bit about that and what's happening and if there are hypotheses and where it might go?
Well, there's only so much I can tell you because it's not finished yet, but I can give you what I've got for sure. So yeah, for those that haven't seen it, I'm collecting sort of individual stories, I guess. I have a really simple, short Google form online, which asks people to kind of reflect on the relationship between their individual identity and their ability to imagine the future. And it's a research project that I'm working on. It's kind of ongoing, but I'm working towards a submission to the DRS conference, the Design Research Society conference in Chicago next year. There are certain hypotheses for sure. Already those that have anonymously submitted their kind of takes on it are helping me realize my hypotheses aren't completely, correct. Obviously not. I'm only one perspective in this, but it specifically looks at a kind of queer angle on identity. So looking at this idea of marginalized communities kind of evolutionarily have become really good at imagining a future world in which maybe life is better for them. And to what degree those skills or attributes, whatever you want to call them, are developed through oppression, I suppose. There are lots of other things, obviously, that form our ability to imagine, and our identity is made up of much more than whether we identify as queer or not, or anywhere on that spectrum. But what I've found so far has been really interesting. But I don't want to give you too much because I'm I'm saving it for the conference.
That's super exciting. It's really, really interesting and potentially risky work to be doing, which I respect. And I'm definitely going to be keeping up with it. I'm really, really interested.
Well, I still need more people to fill out the form. So if this is a shameless plug, I'm going to make it.
Yeah. Fill out the form. Look it up. We'll share it when we share the episode.
Thank you.
Flash it in neon letters on screen a few times.
And could you tell us about the experiential realism platform? Because that's another thing you've done that I think people see, I see, and I'm like, this is interesting. Things that come out of it are always really compelling, and defining it, maybe it has been harder to grasp and get a handle on.
Yeah, I mean, you called it a platform, and I think that's the best name I can come up with for it at the moment still. It's like a whole bunch of different things all under one umbrella. And it has sort of evolved out of my teaching practice over maybe the last 15 years. And I was researching for a book called Experiential Realism, which very quickly and loosely is the sort of self-titled sort of pedagogy that I use with the students, so my teaching methods and philosophies. And I was looking for student contributions to put in the book, largely aimed at students and academics in the sort of architecture and design fields. And I thought it would be completely unethical to put only my own students' work in the book. So obviously I look to LinkedIn and Twitter and Instagram for contributions from, elsewhere to see what was happening around the rest of the globe. And I was just absolutely floored by the sheer volume of student work in the sort of speculative fields across disciplines that were clearly quite hungry and eager to share what they were doing with people. But I only had like 16 pages in the book, so I could only feature like 4 projects. And I've got these hundreds of people getting in touch saying, oh, this is really great. I'd love to be involved. Can you tell me more about it? And so, yeah, I realized that there was a need of sorts. And I am my father's daughter. And if people need things, I'm like, I must provide a service of some sort to help these people. So I set up the website. And on the website is what I call the project store. So students and graduates can submit work they've done and I upload it. And it's just a great sort of archive for those people around the world to kind of see what's happening elsewhere. And from that, engaging with all those graduates and students and learning about their work, I was then getting a ton of questions around, okay, so I've got a degree now, but I want to work in this sort of speculative field, but I don't know how to do it. Do you know anyone that I can talk to? Is there anyone I could speak to? Do you know of any jobs going? And I'm like, well, I can try and help, but I didn't, clearly there's another need, which was to connect people who want some help with people who've got the experience. So the next part of the platform has become a mentoring program. So global mentoring program, which kind of matches students and graduates with a practitioner or an academic in the field, and they just work together for 6 months, completely free. People volunteer their time. And we've done 3 full, almost finished our 3rd full year now. So, and just as that completed, the book came out from which it all started. So this kind of 3-year cycle, all right, start to finish. Yeah. So it's a whole bunch of different things under one umbrella, really.
Brilliant. Cool. Thank you. Well, thank you for being here. We'll get started. Trevor, what is your crudest hint?
Well, it makes it sound like such a dirty joke, or like I'm about to drop a dirty limerick on everybody. I think like my other 2 guests here, I've come up with a veritable library of weak signals, or like signals who need to put their back into it.
You gotta pick one.
Signals who could try a little bit harder to turn into something useful.
The weak ones.
Digital culture is one bucket we could dive into. Science and health is another. There's some like technology stuff we could go into, maybe like space, we could call that bucket. Which one do you think is most interesting? And maybe we could do like a little around the table, like what kind of weak signals do you folks have, Jem and Tobias?
Mine is education based.
Educational, okay.
I've got across energy, land use.
Land use and energy, very good.
Land use, energy, autonomous vehicles.
Okay, I'll start with one.
Furthest from there.
Yeah, I'll start with one in like manufacturing then, which is like tied to my personal life.
All right.
And also tied to like global macroeconomic and material cycles.
I like it.
Many of you have probably picked up on this signal already, but Lego has walked back a claim they made about 7 years ago, that they were going to, by around this time, have a plan in place and the executional plan in place to make all of their bricks out of PET instead of ABS, the kind of plastic they're currently made out of. Much more recyclable, more circular supply chain for them to work on and so on. So they set this goal. Everyone was like, of course Lego can do it. Loved by children everywhere, making things that last 100 years. Fantastic. Go at it, Lego. Save the world. They can't do it.
Mm-hmm.
Lego's head of sustainability announced about 2 weeks ago that if you look at the full carbon emissions over the life cycle of the manufacturing process and the physical bricks and everything, they would be releasing more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere by converting to a recyclable supply chain in their manufacturing.
Right.
The machines are more complex. The machines themselves have a much higher and wider global footprint than they did 40 years ago when they came up with the ones to build out of ABS. And a fascinating signal, I think, of the difficulty, even when you're like a relatively straightforward consumer brand, that's like, we make 100 variations or 1,000 variations of these little pieces of interconnecting plastic. let's move towards a circular economy. Let's reduce our greenhouse gases emissions significantly. Let's make carbon neutral Lego. Way harder than they thought it would be.
Mm-hmm.
And not for the reasons they thought it would be. The recycling turns out to be easy. The collection turns out to be easy, like getting people to give in broken bricks. They have all the infrastructure for that. But they can't in good conscience move forward with this plan because they've looked at the broader system view and realized this is actually going to make it worse, not make it better. I suspect a lot of organizations in manufacturing, particularly where like the product hasn't changed a whole lot in the last few decades, are about to hit some similar version of this. We assumed by swapping out the old dirty machines and processes we use to create leather sofas, we would have a dramatically more sustainable supply chain. It turns out if we want to replace all those machines, like there's quite a cost to replacing all those machines. And in Lego's case, like I've never seen a Lego making machine or baking machine, but I imagine it's the size of my home or larger. And it is kind of astonishing to realize that in their grand calculus, changing out that machine is responsible for a greater environmental penalty in the form of greenhouse gas emissions than changing the material they make billions of bricks out of.
Right.
Interesting bottleneck there. And so this has been a sustainability story that I've spent a lot of time talking to my kids about, who are 5 and 10, who are big like Lego heads, and they've been really into this. And I think this is a weak signal of a kind of trough of disillusionment, if you will, we might slip into on sustainability and manufacturing, where it's like, everyone wants it. It looks like the right idea. We're doing it for the right reasons. And if we actually follow through with it, we're being worse citizens than we were before. So we're not going to do it.
Right. So it's funny, though. I don't come to a point of disillusionment hearing this. My sense and what surprises me about this signal is like I would frame it as getting real about greenwashing. And there's something like so responsible where I'm still kind of loving Lego, at least from the way you retold this, where I'm like, oh, they had a sustainability officer come up and say, like, we can't do this. Here's why. It doesn't actually make sense the way we thought it would. We're thinking about this from a systems perspective. We're not just like coming up with ideas that sound nice and throwing them on the package so you keep buying our product.
Yeah, I appreciate the candor and like the system view transparency. I think as with any weak signal, you want to look at like the way the signal's been encoded. And if you go look at it, like the Financial Times broke this story that Lego was walking back their vision. And all of the language in the story and in the vast majority of the subsequent stories, even on design blogs and like manufacturing like wonk sites, is Lego abandons plans. Like Lego fails. Lego can't do it. And I think that is, to your exact point, an interesting thing to keep an eye on, that people almost want this to be a bad story.
Yeah.
It seems. The journalistic coverage of it, the intention is to like highlight the impossibility of the task, when what they've done is actually, I think, far more noble and conscientious.
Right. And I think there's also, maybe we underrate plastic sometimes, and it's like, is Lego the enemy? It's like the water bottles that get thrown away, and like the single-use packaging strikes me as like a real problem, because there are like these structures that are built and actually built to last. They get tossed out after one use. Lego, I think, lasts generations and can be used and passed on for like that could be like an heirloom. So yeah,
it was a component of their situation is that the PET Lego pieces turned out to be unlikely to last 100 years of use.
I see.
And that's what their ABS stuff does. And I do indeed. Though that is, yeah, sure, creating some plastic waste. I appreciate 100-year intended life cycle on a consumer product. Very rare.
Yeah.
Does the PET hurt less if you stand on it?
Good question. That's a key performance metric they should have been keeping an eye on. I suspect no.
There's like a parallel with IKEA, which feels like IKEA went through the right questions to arrive at their answer, whereas Lego went for the big bang, we'll make a big statement and do some tech innovation. IKEA published a report 10 or more years ago saying that the world has got enough IKEA, was the root of it. So they were like, well, then what is IKEA for? Well, we also meet our sustainability commitments. And that's where they started experimenting with, not just like other types of products and other materials, but like entire other ways of interacting with what they do, and thinking about their role as this sort of brand that everybody knows. I saw a statistic the other day that said 3 in 10 people were conceived on an IKEA bed, right? It's like a
that's a great one.
Part of everyone's life. So the real question for Lego is, Lego is this huge global brand and they make this product that everybody really knows. And as you say, it lasts forever. So it's a rethinking of what the sort of retail producer interaction is, which IKEA has sort of been going through for the last 10, 15 years. What they need to do, really. And I know like Lego, they have like their Play Lab who do bits of that, but it doesn't feel as front and center as it is with IKEA, where they're always publishing these sort of really experimental, innovative ideas about like the future of the home and the future of IKEA's role in the home. I mean, I guess Jem, you might know more about that stuff that's going on.
Well, yeah, I sort of think about it from the perspective of, if one of their performance indicators is they want it to last 100 years, then arguably, do they need to keep producing at the rate at which they are producing? And I sort of figure, does it need to be a wholesale switch out, one for the other? Could it not be a slow, steady, kind of phased process where, one is sort of phased out whilst the other is phased in?
Switched a few things in, like, for the hardcore Lego fan listeners, there's going to be some like bricks I don't know the names of, but like the little steering wheel brick with the 2-spot clicker on the bottom. I think that was transitioned a few years ago.
Okay.
And some of the more like eccentric pieces, probably representing a small fraction of their production capacity, are already indeed switched over to either PET or something else.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously haven't read the article you're referring to, but when I hear it can't be done, all I think is it must be able to do something, surely. It's got to be, it's not a yes or no. It's like, how far down the line are you willing to go and is worth going?
Yeah, and it's like, if they've done a whole system carbon assessment, like over what time frame have they done that?
This is it. What's the payoff?
Yeah, they'll have some model. Like if you look at, like, for instance, the cheapening cost of solar energy over the last 15 years, it's 6,000% decrease or something. So like once you project over a long enough time scale, at what point does it cross that tipping point where it's like, this was worth it? You know what I mean? Because obviously they made that commitment for 5 years and they're saying we couldn't do that, can't do that.
Yeah.
But could they
just need to stick with it longer?
Yeah.
They were pretty cagey on how long of a total life cycle assessment are we performing. I sort of filled in the auto completed and assumed, as you do with weak signals sometimes, that it was like 100-year assessment or something. But who knows? Maybe they looked at 15.
To your other point about trough of disillusionment, there is a pattern here that's been coming up in terms of like this narrative that's the exposing of recycling, that it's like recycling is fake, basically. The sort of failure, I think, in a lot of markets of the reusable bags at grocery stores, like certainly near me, the bag that you buy, I don't think will last 1 year anyways. So it's probably more wasteful than the previous plastic bag. So there's these issues that seem to keep coming up and are producing more skepticism, and not just like where there's greenwashing happening, but where there's actual actions being taken, programs being created through government that are failing.
The conversation that we get at work, a lot of what people suggest is because over the last 20 years, all the easy stuff has been done. So all the easy things you can do to reduce your carbon cost as a company or a state have been done. You've transitioned to gas in the case of the UK away from coal. You sort of put stuff around carburetors and sort of the easy regulations. And now it's the hard stuff. And so you're either scrabbling around for small things that appear that you're doing something but aren't, like banning plastic straws, or you're making it a cultural issue, like it's happening in the UK at the moment, where net zero is the current cultural issue that the right wing are up against, because it's seen as taking away liberties, because it's harder. It will make life harder for people to meet some of these targets now. And that's like a lot of people that I've been talking to, in regards to work projects we're doing at work, are saying is that the problem is we've done the easy bits. The bits that were going to be uncontroversial and straightforward are done. And now to keep going on this path, we need to do hard stuff. I'm
from Canada, and I've heard that common to the United States and Canada is in the 1980s, when recycling was like emerging and en vogue as a Hail Mary solution, North America adopted recycle, reduce, reuse as the 3 R's, which is the opposite of how you're supposed to think about it and operate it into your life. But reduce is obviously a quality of life adjustment for people, whereas recycle is like a technological solution that's black boxed and like just like a garbage dump, except something comes out the other side. Whereas I think in other places, reduce and reuse come first, as they are supposed to in the mantra of the 3 R's.
Right. The other thing coming up for me is the toy industry has no moat. I always think about this when this stuff comes up, but it's like at a society level, we could just realize that like kids don't need a lot to have fun, and that these things are successful, but like
boxes.
A block can be anything. You can play with sand and you can do a lot. A ball is phenomenal and can be, a scrunched up package or something. It's not hard to create fun and to play, yet we rely on these.
So Lego is intergenerational, right? So my parents kept my Lego. When my daughter is old enough, she's not old enough yet to do Lego, they will give to her. And I will be interested to see, A, if she eats it, and B, actually, because I got some Lego from my mum, from her, so it's about 40 years old by the time I got it, which just crumbled to dust. Like the plastic just didn't hold up. Because it'd been in storage in an attic for 30, 40 years.
You should do like an unboxing video on TikTok, Tobias, where you're like, look at this Lego! They say they can't do better than this. This crumbled to dust.
So Lego Care would be an opportunity for them to create a kind of program for that. I think and also just use would probably do a lot. Like that probably has to do with just air quality or whatever.
I also think it's probably a different world now, right? If you think about it, I've got like a very young daughter, and the sort of market of secondhand stuff is huge, right? You can get rid of clothes within a few hours. Someone else will want, a onesie or whatever, and it's super easy to find stuff. That's a different world to 30, 40 years ago, where that sort of internet-enabled network of my friend David described having a child as just getting a device that firmware updates every 24 hours. So that sort of requirement to replace everything every 24 hours is a lot harder if you don't have that network.
Adequate.
Well, signal or noise. Jen, what do you think?
I think it is a signal, but I think it's a signal that maybe big companies, if they really want to be sustainable, they need to consider whether we actually need their products or whether they need us to buy them. Like, surely the real challenge for Lego would be in a truly sustainable world to say, do you know what, we've got enough Lego now. Let's make a new thing branded as Lego. Like, what is the next Lego product that can be made with a different machine that is better, that doesn't require, pumping loads more kind of toxic gases into the air? For me, that's the signal. Like, will a company ever be able to say, okay, we've made enough of this now. let's do something different.
Yeah. Tobias, what do you think?
I think it is a signal for the reasons I said earlier, that it's a signal of this nadir we're at with reducing carbon in the atmosphere, which is that, all these great promises and plans are running up against the real hard stuff of infrastructure, materials, everything else. The easy stuff's been done. Policies are either being diverted or rolled back. This story is one of like lots that we've seen in other places as well, where the promises of processes and materials actually run up against the hard stuff of life and don't work. And I think we've seen a lot of it even over the last 6 months. I think it's a signal of that. There's a paradigm shift required now for the next level of change that we need to make.
Yeah.
Jim suggested, right? It's not just a new technology, it's a change of what our business is.
It is. I mean, I even think there's a way in which this is a change of what a career is, or what a sustainability officer is, or what it is to do these things, where we need to, if we are to get real and do hard things that are required to create these kinds of changes, that could be devoting your entire career to this and figuring it out over the course of that. And it's not easy. It's not as easy as the sort of role that some of us might play in advisory, as like throw it in a scan and say, like, here's this new development that came out of this university and could change everything. It's like, to actually implement these things, you have to think about them in a systems level, and to make these changes, because it's so costly, will take a long time. And are people willing to do that? There's a lot of like maybe just coming to terms with how unsexy some of this work really is. And that's what I hope. I don't like that word, but my hope hearing this signal was that was the vibe of where Lego's coming from. But we'll see.
Yeah. I mean, for me, if they have legitimately said themselves, we can't make this product in a sustainable way, they need to argue why they're still making it in the old way. So don't make it, or make something else, or find a way to make it better.
Edible Lego is clearly the answer. The kids are already up for it. All we need to do is make it digestible for them. There was a David Cronenberg movie that came out last year called Crimes of the Future, where a small group of children have evolved not just the ability to digest oil-based plastics, but the necessity to digest oil-based plastics for their metabolism, or they die. Very unsettling. And there's a child eats a plastic garbage can in the opening scene of the film.
Right. Isn't there a Lego eating bacteria that can turn these into hamburgers for us?
Everyone's jazzed about plastic eating bacteria now, right?
Yeah.
Again, just clinging onto anything.
All right. I'm glad we solved that. Tobias, what's your weakest signal?
I'm going to continue on this materials train, I've decided. So I have two, there's one signal, but there's two instances of it that I noticed when I was looking through my bookmarks. So, I love to name a hashtag when I'm on your benighted show, Rob. So I'm going to call this retro ancient materialism. Let's do that. That sounds
right.
No, it's not very catchy. We'll come up with something better. Basically, there were two interesting things that come up where they both lauded these technological innovations for using ancient materials and processes. A lot of the work we're doing at work at the moment is around regenerative design and looking at how we're looking at indigenous practices and traditional ways of relating to the land and things like that as a way of restoring ecosystem health and asking a lot of these questions about what even is a business, what is design in those worlds. But these were two very specific technologies that have been developed. So the first is a carbon capture technology, which Microsoft earlier this year invested a bunch of money in, which I imagine was part of a carbon offset deal. And it's basically a way of using limestone, like a highly processed limestone of some sort, laid out in big trays to make a massive surface area that literally just soaks carbon up from the atmosphere. And these guys claim that this process is as old as sort of humans. It's the same process that was used by the Romans to make mortar. So but what's interesting is they keep talking about it in the press as this great ancient technique, older civilization, blah, blah, blah. The second thing is a bit more crazy, which is some researchers at MIT created a supercapacitor out of just concrete and carbon black. And carbon black is basically a form of charcoal. So it's again, really available. Apparently the Dead Sea Scrolls were written in carbon black. So there you go. And basically what it is they get the cement or concrete and they inject water mixed with carbon black into it. The carbon black is highly hydrophobic and it automatically spreads out in a fractal pattern through the concrete and the cement. And because it's also chargeable, it carries an electric current because it's carbon. It can become a supercapacitor and it becomes insulated by the water. And so the speculation from these folks at MIT, which I did put out an ask at work this morning in the right forum to find out if this is true or feasible, is that this could be used as the concrete the buildings are made of. Right, you could have a building that is literally just storing energy in its concrete because it's 3% carbon black, which is just a supercapacitor. And supercapacitors can't store as much as a lithium battery, but they obviously are. This type of supercapacitor would obviously be a lot less environmentally costly because it's using readily available materials and literally embodied carbon, and it charges and discharges faster. So for an emergency, let's say you're running solar panels on your roof and there's a windy day or a rainy day, for 24 hours, a building could store the energy in the literal fabric of the building. And that's fascinating. It's an amazing technology. I don't have the scientific understanding to judge the veracity of it, but it's a published paper, so I assume there's some truth to it. And they've done tests at coin size, battery size scale, and I think they've proven it can store and discharge 3 volts, which is enough to power a small light, similar to Breeze Punk and our tiny little windmill from last time. But the interesting thing again is this leaning of the narrative, and it builds on what we were just talking about on ancient materials and processes. The idea that there's no brand new super thing here. We haven't made some brand new element that no one's heard of or developed an incredible alloy. It's just stuff we have every day, super easy to come by. That is, the technical process to get it into its ready state might be quite complex. That limestone tray requires heating it to 1600 degrees or something, but apparently it can absorb more carbon than it takes if it's electrically furnace. And again, it hasn't been proven at huge scale, but Microsoft has invested enough to offset 75% of their yearly carbon over the next 10 years, apparently, in it, if it works. But yeah, that's my weak signal. Is everyone's super jazzed by Roman batteries now. Like that's what we're into, making carbon capture out of limestone. And an anecdote here to add to this is that, like, obviously at work we do a lot of stuff on sustainable buildings, and I sometimes bring up the example of the Baths of Caracalla, which are arguably one of the most sustainable buildings in Europe, in that they were built in the 500 ADs and they still stand, and every single material using it was from within a 20-kilometer radius.
Right.
Apparently it paid off its carbon budget in the first 100 years of its operation. So, and made from limestone. There we go. That's my signal. Retro ancient Roman batteries.
So are you saying by putting retro at the start of that, is there a way that this can be applied to existing concrete structures, or does it have to be
the romance of it?
Does it have to be sort of from new? Because I'm thinking back to Lego already, and everyone goes, "Well, this is a great technology, but actually we can't afford to knock down all of our existing buildings and make them out of this new."
From what I know, a building process, it would have to be from new, because this has to be done in the solidifying of the concrete. Like, they inject this hydrophobic water carbon black mixture, and then that spreads like veins through the concrete as it's going. So that's the reason I put out this post on the forum at work. So I was like, that doesn't sound super stable to me, but these MIT folks are claiming it's theoretically possible.
Or safe. Immediately,
yeah, exactly. That's what I mean. Would it
being stored? Building.
Would it meet the sort of standards of safety?
Health and safety, yeah.
But maybe if it was non-load bearing, it could work like a decorative wall.
That's where the innovation probably needs to. If the technology works and is viable, then yeah, absolutely. My sort of question would be around how it can be applied to existing structures rather than maybe being load bearing. Is it a facade tile? Could it just be poured into basements and kind of act as kind of a thermal mass and an energy mass?
Was it one of your students? It was an RCA student, but it was a student I saw at a crit who was making Portuguese tiles out of captured carbon.
That was not.
Was it not? It was a very cool project, and they'd sort of gone and seen all these craftspeople in Portugal and discovered this process, and then found a way to sort of put carbon into the tiles of the carbon capture system. But yeah, exactly. It could be a facade or a decorative piece, maybe.
Yeah, because the conversation before around reduce and reuse and recycle, the interiors program at the RCA, which is the course that I teach on, one of our platforms is called Reuse, and it is dedicated purely to the reuse of existing structures. And the professor that leads it, his mantra is and always has been, we have to reuse what we've got. So my platform is Super Futures, his is Super Reuse. You see the pattern here. And he argues that we have everything we need. We have all the buildings we need. We have all the materials that we need. Like, if we can find a way to reuse them and displace them and reappropriate them in other ways, if something has to be demolished, can it be dismantled beautifully and logically, and those components relocated elsewhere where they can be reused? And if our existing building stock were not only seen as a vehicle to put program within, but it could also be seen as one of those local resources, as you said, the example you gave of Caracalla.
That's the Caracalla, yeah.
Yeah. If buildings that are vacant are on that list of resources that can be utilized, then it kind of really changes how we think about designing or reusing what we already have.
I mean, it's a diversion, isn't it? But as I understand it, the regulation in most places around retrofit is so difficult compared to new builds that it becomes the cheaper option by default for most developers.
That's where the problem lies, is in the protocols I've put in place.
There's a thing in Europe about, like, in the EU, like something like 80% of retrofit is stored up for up to 50 years or something. I can't remember the exact statistic. It's one of those things we came across in research. But then there's this question, going to Trevor's earlier point about like whole life carbon, is if you could build it out of a material that is becoming part of an energy system itself, like part of a distributed energy grid, where over what time does replacing that concrete become more efficient?
Yeah.
I'm curious about the other aspect of this, which is the reuse of old ideas and old technologies. And the retro ancient fetishism, I guess, in this case.
That's a better way of putting it.
Fetishism is hot. Yeah, that's spicy.
Of why people are so excited about it. And I mean, maybe this is the antidote we need for future fetishism. But yeah, what do you think it is about the way these stories are being told that's
fascinating, isn't it? I think last time, or maybe the time before, we talked about the sort of excitement around like back to the land and stuff, and this sort of, and I was even talking to someone today about like Mark Andreessen's horrible manifesto, and how if you're at the cutting edge of technology and you're having to make it a political cause, and then clearly you've lost.
How good can your technology utopia be if you have to rant about it?
Exactly. So I think there's something really interesting about people finding that narrative quite appealing, right? That there's some purity or some rigor or something in those older techniques, you know.
It's also quite reassuring that the solution may have always been there. We just there is an answer, and it's a simple one, and that, you know, we can learn from the past. I don't know. I find that quite reassuring. I like a simple idea.
Both of these things they're very complicated processes to produce them, as far as I understand it. But the materials they use are really available. That's the thing, right? Is that they're taking things that are all around us, we use all the time, but doing a different thing to them. So the innovation is in the process by which the carbon black is put inside the concrete, or the limestone is prepared for carbon capture, the cork or whatever it's called. I can't remember, but whatever limestone is when you turn it into sticky substance.
I feel like there's a third really good example of this that is maybe like that is obvious in our news sphere, but I can't put my finger on it. My mind just keeps flashing to like pictures of people like jaw dropped looking at like the Antikythera mechanism or something and being like, whoa, we gotta build this again.
There's like, say, in the sort of regenerative design movement, there's a lot of, you know, reappraisal of sort of indigenous and traditional techniques. Like I've been reading this fantastic book I'm going to plug called Margin Lands by Arati Kumar Rao and Mansi Parekh, who's a futurist in Mumbai, gave this to me. You know, and a lot of this is about how many of the practices of like desert farmers, or at least the first two chapters have been about how the practices of desert farmers have been so fundamental in sustaining those ecosystems. And then, of course, the Indian government came in and sort of just built canals through the desert and started to like, you know, undo all that work that they'd made to really carefully maintain it. And it all became imbalanced. The water's really unhealthy. Like a lot of the, you know, fauna and flora's died off. Obviously, the farmers are you know, out of business and stuff like that. And there is, I feel like, a reappraisal of these things and a better understanding of the understandings that maybe aren't coming from so-called rational Western science that's happening in the regenerative design movement.
I mean, it's got me thinking of like a few of the other words. I started thinking about smoking versus vaping, and smoking being this thing that had been around forever, and then vaping being the supposed healthy solution. Turns out what we should have known super intuitively immediately. And I remember a futurist friend of mine when I was learning the discipline, Sadi Ducros, who, you know, I think Trevor, just being like, I don't know, it doesn't seem to add up, like inhaling all of this vapor right into your body. Like it just seems like it's spreading it out even more. Like, you know, at the time, like this is, you know, 15 years ago or whatever it was. And I was like, yeah, it makes sense. But, you know, what happens is maybe just reduce your smoking was the answer, and it was more like moderate in that case. And, you know, the marketing was what sort of didn't allow that. It was sort of pushing, I mean, down to the amount of cigarettes in a pack to, you know, all of the advertising, whatever else, that just kind of encouraged a completely different way of doing this practice that was, you know, you could argue was a medicinal or even a breathing meditative practice in the history of humanity. Which, speaking of which, yoga and meditation are other examples of things that have popped back up as solutions to new problems. And they just seem desperately needed today.
There is a very human, like, intergenerational narrative element to the we've resurrected an idea from the past and found it's a perfect fit for today that I think empowers us to feel like, obviously, we have more of a connection with our ancestors than we thought we did. And we're using what they used, and they foresaw our problems as perhaps the exaggeration you could come to, and that feels good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the other thing, and I just thought of it when I was thinking about I think our last conversation, again, maybe the one before, was the thing that excited me about those little wind turbines was it was an intervention in energy transition that didn't involve clearing a vast bit of land and putting solar panels or a wind turbine up and going through all that stuff. It's like it's a thing that's just embedded in the world. It's like the ubiquitous computing of green energy. And, obviously we've got like loads of people doing distributed power in different ways. And this feels like the natural extension of that. I've got a couple of friends who work in the battery problem, which is that we can get green energy places, but we don't have a great solution for what happens when you can't access green energy, right? The grid isn't really set up for it properly. We don't have proper battery storage. Batteries are expensive and difficult. And it feels like this is hinting again at that. It's just part of the environment. It's just like we thought computers would be, but we've just done it with energy systems. They're just the things we live in and around all the time, which seems like quite exciting to me. It reminds me of there's a book from Ian M. Banks called Fearsome Engine. Do you guys know this one? The great Ian M. Banks sci-fi author. It's a difficult read because it's all written phonetically. Yeah, it's spelled like everything sounds rather than how it should be spelled. But in that book, the world is a computer. So they literally inhabit, like, the structures around them are all part of a giant computer, and they're just in this computer all the time. And this is this idea of embedding energy capture, storage, and distribution systems just as part of a building, not just wiring, but actually in the fabric of the building, is quite romantic in a way. And again, similar to some of those things that we're looking at in regenerative design about how structures in hotter parts of the world are naturally designed to either capture or repel heat. It's not like an extra bit of technology, it's just in the design of the structure and the shape of it and everything else.
I think the one I was thinking of, Tobias, that was like in the back of my mind is like pumped water storage as a giant battery, which is not a new idea, like
right.
And yet I feel like Switzerland, where that's really popular, and a couple of parts of Canada, that's like is portrayed as like this miracle idea we resurrected of use energy to put the water up the hill, and then when you need energy, push the water down the hill again.
I love the simplicity. Fearsome Engine sounds like something that runs on Crude hints. What do we think? Signal or noise, Jen?
I think it's a signal. For me, it is a signal of our human instinct to trust or believe in whatever came before us, and a signal of our maybe fear or uncertainty, comparably of what's to come. So your example of the vape, right? There's always going to be the cynics thinking, and it's exactly why actually I won't get laser eye surgery. I'm convinced in 10 years' time they're going to discover it's a complete disaster and I'm going to be blind. And I'm like, well, I'm almost blind now. I just wear contact lenses. So why would I risk being maybe much more blind later on? I don't know. I feel like it's more a signal of our desires to find our answers from the past than have to trust technological innovation or policies or politics or economics from the future.
Trevor, what do you think?
I think that riffing on what Jem was just saying, I think there's definitely a tendency we have to sort of, to different extents, like depoliticize the past. I feel like that book, The Dawn of Everything, David Graeber and Wengrow's book, was like a really fascinating, eye-opening experience for me into like, we've been politicizing everything for 10,000 years. This is what we do. Like make narratives and convince people to follow along with them and differentiate from the other narratives around you. And I think the word you use, Jem, that like we have a desire to trust the past, I think is like right on. That's the emotional core of it, I think, is we want to believe that in a simpler time, which is not accurate, people came up with like purer solutions to things. And I'm not sure which, like, if I were to fit this one into our handy steep V formula, I don't know what kind of trend this would represent. It's about the built environment. It's about energy. It's about social values. It's about policy. Certainly tech and the environment fit in there neatly. So it's a good cross-spectrum signal, I think, that punches above its weight. I'm not really sure what's there. Like, are we really going to rebuild our society around the Antikythera mechanism? Or does this tell us something about how we're responding to things right now? And I think it's the latter.
I like that. Signal.
Yeah.
Jem, what is your weakest signal?
I've been in academia for what feels like forever, probably longer than anyone wants me to be. I don't know. So I'm kind of immersed in higher education, like how it's run, how it's organized, who's doing what. And I'm forever on the lookout for kind of more innovative or radical ways of structuring education or universities specifically. And so my week signal is about the future of the university. There's been a new institution open in London a couple of years ago, which has just 2 degrees, one undergraduate and one postgraduate. And they say it's the first program of its kind, and it's the first new university to have degree awarding powers since like the 1960s. They claim they're kind of challenging our Russell Group universities. And it's an institution called the London Interdisciplinary School. Don't know if you guys have heard of it. They took their first cohort in September 2021. So it's a 3-year undergraduate program and a 1-year master's program. And the name of the program is Interdisciplinary Problems and Methods. So there's plenty of other institutions that have interdisciplinary studies or interdisciplinary studies and something else, but it's the first one to kind of focus on complex problems and cross-disciplinary solutions to that. And so I guess what I'm super interested in is it like the start of this creep towards a sort of post-disciplinary education system where we're no longer in departmental silos? Like for anyone who's been in academia, the organizational structures of universities seem quite odd. They're all organized differently. Sometimes it's just based on whichever other school your building is next to. Sometimes it's for proper kind of research value, and other times it's purely sort of economic. And these departmental barriers, I believe, really kind of hamper innovation, in many ways. And so I'm really interested whether this is a signal of like moving away from sort of profession-based degrees, or I don't know if you guys have seen this book. So I've had it for years, and it's one of those books that I just sort of flick through every now and again. For those that didn't catch it on the video, it's called Alternative Universities, Speculative Design for Innovation in Higher Education, and it's by David J. Staley. I've never actually read it cover to cover, but it's the first time I've ever seen speculative design actually applied to the system of education rather than being something that's kind of practiced within. And it's really cool. It's 10 chapters and 10 radical scenarios for different types of institutions. And there's one in here, which I think is probably closest to the example I just gave in London, which he calls the polymath university, where the curriculum requires students to have 3 majors. Everybody must have 3 majors, and they must come from, one must be a sort of profession-based major, one has to be a science or social science, and one has to be a humanities. So you can't have someone doing history, geography, and another one. They have to be kind of cross disciplines. And yeah, I suppose for me, it's an indication or a recognition of this argument of we live in a complex world with complex problems, and will a bunch of kind of super intelligent specialists ever be able to connect the dots enough to formulate potential solutions to the problems we've got? Now, obviously, not all universities can be run in this way, but for me, the LIS or this kind of polymath university, where I think he called it a culture of intellectual promiscuity, which I love as a concept. Yeah, I just think, I'll stop rambling, but is this an example of de-siloing education?
Good question. Or is it a new silo?
Possibly.
Yeah,
different shaped one.
Different silo.
I want to put out a kind of a strong opinion weekly held and see if this is a controversial take or not. So as somebody who, believes strong, I use the term disciplinary promiscuity and have been saying that for like 10 plus years, and basically have an education in interdisciplinary thinking that was sort of self-styled humanities poetics, sneaking into business school kind of education. And somehow I still think that this is a bad idea. Don't create an interdisciplinary school and make that a degree and make that the focus and have that be the thing itself. However, I think as a class that is maybe mandatory, a kind of methods, project organizing, sense making, working through things, the whole spectrum, design thinking, all of the tools and methods, futures thinking, all of the stuff that we do. I'm not totally into the idea of the futures. I didn't go to one of them, but the future studies university. So, I mean, this may be a controversial take here. And yeah, so I mean, that's the take. It should be a class, should be a mandatory first year class. And maybe should be something that you have dedicated as a half year course or something, like all through your university, but not a major.
I'm going to also fall a little bit on the side of Rob here. I like this because we're into a really prominent debate. I was an academic for 10 years, and 4 or 5 of those years I was running courses and programs and things. And then towards the end of my time, we had a plan to redesign our school, the design school at LCC, which is I'm going to say about 1,500 students, postgrad, undergrad, all design degrees, so graphic design, interaction design, that kind of stuff. And we identified the same problem. We got all these like micro-sliced courses and domains and subjects that are effectively, not literally, because everyone was very collaborative, but effectively competing for resources, right? Effectively competing to be the one that recruits enough or gets the funding bid or whatever it is. And we knew intellectually that interdisciplinary practice is great. But then there's this other problem, which is that if a student comes and they go, I just really want to be a great graphic designer, like you sort of owe it to them to be like, great, we're going to give you the best goddamn graphic design education you ever had. Like, I'm not going to force you into a space that you don't want to do. But then we also know from years of experiencing that someone might come in on day one, particularly undergrads, and go, I want to be a great graphic designer. And 3 years later, they're doing like interactive filmmaking with, feminist collections in Brazil, to think of like one example, right? So they've transitioned over that phase into different practice. So how do you allow for both those things? The idea we had was effectively, and you're probably quite familiar with this, Jen, we used to have a foundation year where you had that year before going to art or design school where you sort of figured out what you were about and messed about.
Yeah.
Basically make year one that. And places like UCA Epsom still do that and things. So they just have a group year one where you just do like creativity. And what you learn in that isn't necessarily disciplinary, but like how to work interdisciplinary, how to critique each other, how to talk, how to like be confident about creativity, all that stuff. And then you go, okay, I'm interested in physical stuff. I'm interested in products. I'm interested in like sustainable products. And you gradually start to develop this pathway to a specific output. And where interdisciplinary approaches have been practiced maybe in the design stuff and formalized, it sort of hasn't gone well. And, I can think of 2 examples off the top of my head where they had to reverse it in a few years because the students just felt rudderless. And maybe that was just the way it was delivered and structured, but there was really bad feedback on both the examples I can think of. It just didn't, And I think what I was going to say is where our discussion came was a zoom out. And there were 2 things that I identify. One is in the UK, universities position themselves in response to government strategy rather than driving government strategy, which means they've had to like become, why are we producing employable people? Why are we supporting research agendas? Rather than saying, no, we're going to tell you what the future should be, which should be the other way around. And the other bit is the fee increase. Just change the relationship between education and educators, became a product overnight in a way that it wasn't before. I was teaching before the fee increase and afterwards, and we thought it could have gone either way, and it became a product. And students became customers. And it'd be interesting mentioning what you were at the beginning. My massive generalization reflection was that the students who really wanted to do that interdisciplinary, broad, exploratory experience of education, but maybe the RCA still does a bit and used to do a bit, came from a very different background to people who maybe first generation of folks going to university, really had to think about getting a job straight out as soon as possible, wanted to develop some really tangible, like career focused skills. And it's a super big tension, it's a real tension. I think for me, the flip is, how do you get universities from stopping them being responders to what's going on in the world to being people that are driving the stuff that's going on in the world?
I mean, and to that point as well, it's very much, particularly if you teach on a profession-based course, let's say like architecture, there's the age-old argument, and I stand very hard on one side of this, the age-old argument of whether the role of the education system is to provide the industry with perfectly formed workers to kind of turn up and do what they're told and kind of oven ready, as it were, or whether the universities are there to kind of provoke and lead and innovate in the discipline rather than sort of mimic the profession. And I quite happily stand up and say I'm on the let's innovate and lead and drive and ask questions, particularly at research-led institutions. But not that there isn't a place for the training side of things too. Absolutely, there is. But I'm not one to quote Henry Ford very often. But didn't he say if I'd asked them what they wanted, they would have said faster horses? But it's a constant battle because students don't necessarily see that they are, certainly not at undergraduate level, sometimes not even at master's level, that their role isn't just to kind of turn up and be the perfect employee, but the economy and the world's and society to a degree is you must do that to get a job, and you're competing for these jobs. So again, the role between the university and the wider society is kind of in turmoil.
And to connect it with something else, there's a lot of interest recently in the fact that we seem to be going back to a world where governments have industrial strategies, which we haven't seen since the 50s or 60s, because they're bringing all their supply chains onshore because of global instability. The last time that happened in the 50s and 60s, the universities were at the forefront of it, right? The University of Utah was building computers. You ended up with these private-public interactions that resulted in incredible labs and innovations and new political sort of ideas and policies coming out of universities. Some of it bad, like Friedman and everything else, but some of it really good. But universities aren't in that position now. They're just sort of scrabbling along at the bottom, particularly in the UK and maybe Europe and the US, to sort of be suppliers of a product rather than being the people who are going, great, you need a new industrial strategy. You need to rethink like what our big national project is, Nokia, Bell Labs, let's get that vibe going. But they're not. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're trying. And I think thinking about UAL, which is my former employer there, the president is in the newspaper all the time writing about how universities need to be back at the forefront, which is great. It'll be interesting to see who the next head of the RCA is and whether they take on that same vibe as well. Yeah.
Watch this space.
I think you've got a signal here. I spent a lot of time 2 years ago. I left my job and was thinking for a while about establishing like an alternative integrative thinking, not a university, but for teenage kids. Mm-hmm. And spent a lot of time looking around this space. And I think like the two links you mentioned or shared, Jem, one to the London Interdisciplinary School. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, we've got the second, the Polymath University. So mm-hmm. Polymath University and LIS seem to share the similar profile of like, let's deliberately mm-hmm. set out to create an interdisciplinary experience and set of like semi-measurable outcomes at the end. I think the bet is that like, mm-hmm. if we put people through this, they will come out noticeably improved. There's this quote I saw floating around on my LinkedIn the other day from a system guy I know named Daniel Rose, and he'd seen a presentation at a conference. It was a service design conference, and the opening slide was only 10% of service design is actual design. The other 90% is setting the conditions for that design to make sense. Yeah. I think that mm-hmm. could be reattributed or contextualized into a few areas we've touched on here today. Like, are we giving the customer what they want, or are we giving the customer what they need? These are two interesting examples, but they have very different business models. Like Polymath University is a not-for-profit, and their goal, I think, is to put as many people through without cost as possible. LIS costs $30,000 Canadian a year. And that's where I think things get a little murky, is we're taking this set of assumptions around, like, if you want to become a top-notch front-end, back-end developer, you want to take these 115,000 of courses. Depending on where you are in the United States or an international student, you're going to pay more. And at the end, you're going to be able to recoup that investment. The integrative thinking thing makes me think about that 10% piece, where if you're trying to create an interdisciplinary learning pipeline that costs $30,000 a year, like what is the presumed role or capability in our society that is like recognized and available economically that you can jump to? And I think having gone through a formal design education, a master's myself, like that is a brick wall at the end of the tunnel where it's like, great, we know futures and cross medium customer insight generation and like how to do really good sense making on complex problems. Who's out there looking for that? And I still haven't met anybody who was like as good at articulating it as the people are who've acquired the alleged skill set. So I wonder about that. I'm like, the $60,000 degree in interdisciplinarity option, that's a lot of money. Is that going to be more economically viable than like a degree in computer science, like building neural nets? And then you've also found all these other interests adjacent to that. And then the other thing is that 1090 that I worry about, of like the people I know who are really good at interdisciplinary stuff figured it out themselves. I think like Rob and Tobias, you were both sort of playing back. They found their way through a lot of grit and some struggle, and hopefully no like violence or real hardship involved, but like through hard work they realized, oh, I have this skill set and I can apply it in these 9 different complementary areas that are not where I'm an expert, but I can add value there, like the T-shaped thinker and IDEO kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you can assume that like 90% of a teaching program on interdisciplinary creativity or imagination is going to translate to results. I think the traditional model of like you spend 90% of your time learning about something and only 10% of your time learning about the things around it. But if you're capable of connecting those dots and willing to put in some of the work, then you can build really rich connections without having to do a 90% education on like thinking laterally and integratively. So it's a tough one. I think your signal is true. This is a thing. And I think the conclusion I'm coming to is that this is a new silo. This is like a specialist silo for interdisciplinary curiosity. And a lot of people are going to go in there. A lot of people are going to like fall into that wasp trap. That's a little pessimistic. And be like, I'm curious, I'm imaginative, I want to be interdisciplinary. And how many of them will come out the other end with like a strong capabilities to execute? I don't know. I think the easy answer to that in a lot of specialty programs is like, as long as we're teaching them to code, they'll figure out how to deploy their knowledge everywhere. So I'm sure that fits in here, but I'm very curious to learn more about both of these institutions, both of which are fairly new to me.
I tend to agree with all of that. There's something, especially the struggle aspect, that I think there's something about like a student being able to go into, as just an example, their film class and show that what they've learned in business school somehow provides a totally different understanding of this film, that this is how you are able to differentiate. And I agree with Trevor too. It's like the students who will do that will do it more often, regardless of what, of what they're being taught it. And I wonder if we all kind of have something like that, but you're sort of differentiator. And like for myself, it's like going into kind of strategic innovation type of work. It's like the thing that sets me apart is having read a lot of like poetry criticism and thinking about ideas and how they kind of turn into a thing in a particular way that I could really map to like a double diamond or any one of these methods that I was like, oh yeah, this is exactly what I do. But it's learning those things without having that background and depth in something. And I feel like it could be anything. And most of the really interesting work in futures, in like speculative futures, it's like somebody has a skill and maybe not the most obvious one. They're coming from theater, they're coming from, whatever it might be.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that excites me about interdisciplinary or not is the sign that different things are happening and punts are being taken and clearly supported for this to go ahead and be running and have received degree awarding powers is a sign that someone in the government is quite happy it's taking place. But I sort of have an emotional connection to the people who have learned to apply things in different places, because I've always never quite felt like I belonged in any of the disciplines I've found myself in. Even when I've kind of clambered my way into them, I've realized that it's not what I thought it was going to be, or it isn't what I wanted it to be, or I disagree fundamentally with the principles or the people doing it. So I'm always sort of happiest when I'm on the edges or on the fence, maybe,
sure,
of those things. And I guess that's how I arrived at futures is by looking at it from an architecture perspective or a sort of spatial design perspective. I'm always excited to see what is coming next. And I feel like the next iteration of this, if it is a signal, is sort of creeping into sort of a post-disciplinarian world. And what does that look like for the higher education system? What absolute bomb does that drop on on the university structures? Like, they would just have a meltdown. How do you even claim to teach that? What is that? And so I like those sort of hand grenade questions.
Jeremy, did you have a thought on the bachelor's of in-betweenness?
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, so much of this seems like a response to kind of the existing technology that's enabled a kind of free education model. The YouTube channels. I was listening to a podcast with a guy who came from, of all things, glam rock performance background and transitioned into a UFC fighter and then a commentator of UFC, and basically said, one does not become this thing by looking at YouTube content about UFC commentating. You just go and do it, and then you find the way to differentiate yourself. And it seems like I feel like universities must just be like, what are we going to do? Like, there's so much free education out there, and if I want to learn how to do something, I can get a lot of skills under my belt, like skills, like the disciplinary skills. I can watch a ton of YouTube channels and probably get a lot of that. Now, I don't necessarily get the perspective, and I don't necessarily get the real world experience, but it does feel a bit like universities are trying to find a way to stay relevant in a world where there's a hell of a lot of free education out there. And I do kind of agree. Like, my initial background, or what I went to university for, was kinesiology, and I ended up transitioning to philosophy. And for all the good that did me as getting a job out of it, it has helped me, I think, be a better thinker and consider the way problems work out. But again, to Trevor's point, like, it wasn't like I got out of university and I was like, hey, everyone, I got my philosophy degree, like, give me the job. I still would have to prove, I guess, my skills in some way. And the job wasn't just there.
This might be a good time to plug my new book, if that's...
Always a good time.
It's called Don't Get a Job, Make a Job. It's very much about that. So it's aimed at creative graduates who, in a world where your degree doesn't afford you an immediate job offer any longer, like, how do you get noticed? How do you kind of stand out? And methods and entrepreneurial kind of strategies for doing that, but all through...
Yeah, so don't pay a $40,000 education. Buy the book. Just buy the book.
Don't let my employers hear that. Hey, look, no, I wrote it as the kind of book I wish had been available for me to read. I graduated my master's just ahead of the big financial crash in the UK. So 2007, 2008, I was coming out of my part 2 in architecture in the UK, and there's a third part to the qualification in the UK. And I was months away from taking that final exam, and I got made redundant in my kind of architecture placement. And honestly, I was in such a pickle, in such a British saying, but I genuinely did not know what to do. This thing I'd spent 10 years, this career I'd spent 10 years kind of setting myself up for and preparing for and working for and paying for, had literally just been ripped out from under me. It was last one in, first one out. It was happening all over the place, of course, not just to me. But I think I was 24, 25, and I've been made redundant twice. And that kind of thing really makes you think about whether this is the career you want. Like, do I genuinely want to do this forever? And the answer was no. I don't want that part 3. I would never get off that train. If there hadn't have been a stop there, I don't think I'd have ever got off of that train. And struggled quite a lot with what to do and how to do it. And I scrambled my way through various things, and teaching was something that I'd always managed to hold on to as like maybe just a day a week, a couple of days a week. And it eventually became the thing that I wasn't just doing to pay the bills, but it became like a real kind of passion for how people learn and how we teach different things differently and to different people. And so I still get a lot of that with graduates. You still have them now. Okay, I've got my degree now. It's a first class degree. what should I do now? It's like, go out and figure it out. And it's, funnily enough, writing the book, it's just easier to give them a link to buy it than give them all the direct advice.
I will say, in to contradict myself and my original take, it is exciting to me that there's these new institutions popping up. And it would have been exciting coming out of high school and knowing that there was like some kind of different option, which I had no idea about at the time when I was graduating high school, of some of the programs that exist. So, but I still hesitate and wonder, would I have benefited that much from it? Would it have, like, somehow I wonder that, is like, would this have just made a kind of vanilla beige outcome?
You know, there are people who intrinsically have these skills and attributes and can look across boundaries, but to give the sort of contradictory position, like maybe these degrees or programs are for those people who want to be able to do it but can't do it intrinsically. And so would it be better if we had more of those interdisciplinary thinkers? I don't know.
I think that is the core of the question for me. Brings in all kinds of complicated filters of like privilege and justice and like, what have I been exposed? What was I exposed to? What did somebody tell me when I was 5 that led me to believe I could be an interdisciplinary thinker at 15? And who else didn't hear that or hadn't connected the dots? It's a great question.
And I think, like all of you, I want to be on the edges, on the overlapping part of the Venn diagram. And as Trevor mentioned here in the chat, the Groucho Marx, I don't want to be a member of any club that will have me as a member. I feel that hard. I've actually been thinking about that a lot, and the ways that maybe that's been to my detriment in my life, but we'll save that for another time. Yeah. So I wonder, even if this was a defined thing, would I just want to be like, I don't want to be part of that either, anymore that I want to be a English major. Anyway, signal or noise, Trevor?
Signal.
Tobias, signal or noise?
I'm going to elevate it beyond those categories. I'm going to say it's a critical uncertainty, because it's beyond that, right? It's something that for 10 years has been in discussion. Well, at least the 10 years I was in academia, it was in constant discussion and never really elevated before it. The reason it's a critical uncertainty is it brings in lots of other variables. At the moment, we have a system where a system that was originally only accessible to the privileged in the 90s and 80s became much more democratized. The idea, not democratized, accessible. The idea that everyone should do it and also be able to decide what they wanted to do with the rest of their lives by the time they were 25 is ludicrous, frankly. And now that system is coming up against this huge wave of online certification and tools and training and things like that, and scrabbling around to figure out what it's for in a narrative of education. You've also got things like Schumacher College, which I think is a really interesting parallel example, super siloed, super disciplined, but in weird stuff. So it's like transformative economics and regenerative farming and all that kind of stuff. So they're like going a completely different route. And then we've all looked at like future of education reports, and they are invariably VR. That's basically it, right? None of them look at like the fundamental philosophy or political organization thing that needs to be thought about. And maybe the good ones might say lifelong learning, but that's about as far as they go. So there's a fundamental philosophical problem underneath it, which is almost like a bit of a too big to fail thing, not financially, but just so socially baked in. This idea of university, this idea that we all need to go to university, this idea that it has this thing that we don't know what it is. And I think that is a big uncertainty. And I think universities will not be the same in 20 years. No doubt about it, right? No doubt about it. Whether they're these broad interdisciplinary things, whether it's much smaller and atomized and super specialist, whether they're, I wrote a bit of speculative design about it in an education journal about 2 or 3 years ago. And what if they're mobile? Like some architecture schools have started doing like pop-up stuff where it just is around an issue for like 3 or 4 years and then disperses again. There's all sorts of things that are bubbling away as experiments, but there's lots of social, commercial, economic, political tensions that are centered on the university that are all coming out of models. So I'm saying critical uncertainty.
I like that.
Can I type all those points together? One of the case studies in the Don't Get a Job, Make a Job book is a girl called Stacey, who made a school called Make Your Own Masters that helps people get professional people to teach them for free how to do these things. She couldn't afford a postgraduate degree, so found a way of, so big up to Stacey Woolsey, I think as her name is, I can't remember now. And anybody can apply and you get a certificate. It's not you don't get to walk across the stage and, high five the vice chancellor or whatever the processes are now. And not only did she do it for herself, she then created an entire program around it to help other people do it too. I just think that they're the kinds of people we want to be innovating in the higher education space, not necessarily these kind of top-down government-funded, dare I say, archaic, big beasts of bureaucracy.
I like that. Yeah, I stand by the idea that there should be more classes dedicated to thinking about problem solving, doing this type of work, because I think that is something that we don't see enough of at all.
And younger too.
And I agree with that too. Younger, more diverse types of universities, yes. And to your last point about make your own masters, yeah, invent your own university. That is like the best advice to an 18-year-old. But it's so good. Broadcast from later.